Hello, welcome to the first video lecture of EDG 1362. Today we will talk about the ethical and legal consideration regarding user research, and we will also talk about storage of data and the process of the NSD application that you might have to do if you are collecting personal data. Whenever you are going to set up a research project which involves participants, you will have to remember that you are operating within an ethical framework, a social framework, which defines what you can and cannot do. This is in part going to be about protection of your participants, either from harm or protecting their privacy, or also defining what is an acceptable methodology in the scientific community. This framework, as many other human conventions, is not universal and will change as you operate in different countries or different companies. So you should always make sure that as you move around entities, you keep up with the different regulation. And this will usually affect mostly the way you store data, the way you recruit participants, and also what is acceptable for you to do with the participants. The first component we are going to talk about is the protection from harm. And this is a duty you have to the participants. And your duty is to protect the participants and avoid any harmful condition during your experiment. So this definition of harm is pretty loose, and so it's not only limited to physical harms, but we are talking about also psychological harm, which could be stress, embarrassment, and similar negative feeling. But the problem is that these feelings might be part of your experiment and might be a planned component as a stimuli to the subject. So if that is the case, then you have to have a very strong argument on why do you need to induce stress, why do you need to induce fear or other feelings, and you have to make sure that the participant is willingly accepting this risk. You might want to talk either with your supervisor or to reach out to an ethics board if you have to have a form of harm in your experiment. The basic right of the participant is to be aware of what will happen to him during the experiment, what is he going to do, and what will happen to his data after the experiment is finished. And you usually ensure that by having a briefing before the experiment and by including all the necessary information in the informed consent, which they need to read and comprehend and sign. You also need to ensure their right to withdraw, which is the right to walk away from the experiment and to do so without a penalty and with the possibility to delete all the data you have about them. And finally, we should also mention that deception is something that could be part of your research design. But as with harm, this is something that has to be highly justified and offset the benefits. So an example of deception would be that you would have to withhold information to avoid bias during an experiment. That is usually acceptable as long as you can argue that the participant would participate anyway if he knew what you were after. When you withhold information, it's also good practice to include a debriefing in which you give to the participants information about what you were really after, in which you give them a possibility to withdraw if they wish to do so. So to reiterate, the participants should be willingly participating to your experiment. There shouldn't be undue pressure, for example, from a power figure as a superior, to take part in the experiment. And you should always make sure that the participant have a full understanding of what the risks are, however small, and what they're going to do, as well as what is going to happen to their data. The informed consent is the main tool at your disposal to ensure this informed and voluntary participation. And it's usually a document that you print out and you give to your participants to read, comprehend, and then sign during the briefing before your experiment starts. You will find a lot of different templates for creating an informed consent, but I will provide you one that is what we are supposed to use here at NTNU in accordance with NSD. In general, an informed consent will explain the reasons behind your experiment, so what you are trying to gain, as well as what is going to happen during the experiment. You should always describe any potential risk or discomfort to the participants, as well as any reward. What will they gain directly, for example, in the form of a payment, or indirectly as, for example, an improvement in their quality of life as you improve a product they use. The informed consent should then describe how you will handle their data, how you will ensure their anonymity, and also how will they be able to withdraw. So this should be described in practical terms, as well as in within which limits they are able to withdraw. For example, it could be the case that after you have anonymized the data, you will not be able to remove them from the experiment anymore, and this should be explained clearly in the informed consent. There they should also find your data or the data of your team, so that they contact you for further information or for withdrawal. Finally, you will need to include the participant signature indicating that they have understood the content of the informed consent. You should keep the informed consent for some time after the end of the experiment, and they should remain in NTNU property, so you should give your informed consent to your supervisor so that he can store them safely. This is the template that you should use. It is complying with GDPR and also with the requirements that NTNU and NSD have. An ethical and legal right of the participants. In its essence, it means that the participants should not be identified by the data that you are going to publish. So this means for you that you should make sure that not only you are only publishing anonymized data, but that you are also making sure that your data is stored safely and away from unauthorized access. Other powerful individual who have an interest in having access to performance information about the subject. So the subject should not be negatively affected by their performance in any way. You should not take privacy law for granted, as it varies substantially across countries and will also vary across companies. So you should take care in informing yourself about what are the local regulations of the institute or company you're working with. refers to the Norwegian Center for Research Data, NSD, which is also compliant to the European law. So that is the example that we are going to use and that you have to follow here at NTNU. As an NTNU student, you have the duty to report your research project if you are planning to include personal data. And you do that through an online platform provided by the Norwegian Center for Research Data. You should report the project before you actually collect the data, at least 30 days in advance, because the approval process takes some time. You can take a look on the NSD website for more information about the process. So before we go further, we should mention what is considered personal data. And most simple definition would be that personal data is any data that lets you identify an individual. And that can be directly if you're using unique identifiers as a phone number, personal ID number, or a name, as well as indirectly. So through a combination of non-personal data that, when put together, are enough details about an individual to pinpoint him in a cohort. This condition is quite difficult to judge, and you have to argue whether for your cohort, for your selection of participants, certain information should, like age, gender, or occupation, are to be considered personal or not. The report process from NSD has been put in place so that we don't abuse and collect unnecessary personal data. So you can in turn avoid reporting to NSD if you only process anonymous data. And anonymous data, as we said, is the opposite of personal, as it doesn't contain any information that can identify an individual. You can usually avoid personal data if you take some precautions, as using paper instead of digital tools, or making sure that the online survey platform you use doesn't track the participants. For this course, we encourage you not to collect any personal data, but if this need would arise, you should talk with your tutor or with your supervisor to see whether that is justified, and also to guide you through the process of applying to NSD. From this point forward, this video will be about how you actually apply to NSD. And although this is maybe something you will not have to use in this class, it might be part of your thesis project or other student project in your future academic career. So you should keep it and get back to this video when you will need to use the NSD platform. You start by logging in on the NTNU platform with your NTNU credential and by creating a new notification form. NSD will then redirect you to a questionnaire which is there to ensure that you really need to go through the application process. There is not much to say about this page apart from the fact that we have seen that eye tracking data is classified as biometric data, and the rest is going to be about whether you are taking pictures, video, or other personal data. Then you will be asked to input the basic information about your project, sort of an abstract in which you explain why do you need to collect personal data and for what kind of project you are applying for. You will be asked about whether you are collecting special categories of personal data. These are data that has more stricter handling, as it is particularly sensitive, as with health data or religious belief. So you should in general try to avoid collecting this data, and I think that will be the case for most interaction design projects. In the project information, you will then add an explanation of how you will use the data, whether if you're just going to use it inside a student project or whether you're planning to make further publications, as well as an explanation of how you will process the data, how you will handle it, go through it, categorize it, anonymize it, and so on. You should also add your data here as a student, while later you will also share it and add the data for your supervisor. Your supervisor is responsible for the way you will handle the data, but it is your duty to add him and share this document with him so that he can actually check what you're doing. You then have to describe all the different samples that you will take. So, for example, a sample would be students of NTNU Jovik recruited from the cafeteria, and what experimental data you will get from this sample and how. You might need to add some extra material depending on what methods you're using. For example, an interview will require you to upload an interview guide, and you should only select the data that you will actually collect from this sample from the list of data that you will collect in the entire research project. You will then have to describe in more details how you will store and analyze the data. One thing that often surprises the student is that you are technically not allowed to handle personal data on your personal computer. So you should talk about it with your supervisor so that you can arrange a safe and legal way to handle the personal data, either by borrowing a computer from NTNU or by using a computer in situ for the analysis of the raw data. Once you have analyzed the data and anonymized it, it's usually not a problem to have it on your personal computer. You will have to provide a timeline matching what you have written in the informed consent about how you will handle the data. So when are you going to delete it, or when are you going to anonymize it, and how long are you going to keep thing as the informed consent. That is usually 3 years, but it should be in NTNU property. So as we said already, you should give that to your supervisor so that he can store it safely. And you should always remember that your reports are a public document, so you should not use pictures of your participants or any other personal data there. To submit the application in time and to share it with your supervisor. You should expect an email from NSD with probably questions or correction to be made to your application. So that might take even more than 30 days if you need to make many corrections. And remember also that at the end of the project, you should be able to log back into NSD and submit the closure of your research project to confirm that you have deleted or anonymized the data. So that was all. Good luck with your research project, and if you have any question, please come to my office. I'm on the second floor of the Musta office building.